Margaret sat in the kitchen, the porcelain cup resting in her palms, long gone cold, while Susan's laughter rang out from the living room inside the very house Margaret once called her own. The walls were the same pale cream she had chosen decades ago with Harold, but everything else had shifted subtly, then entirely. 3 weeks ago, she had signed a document that Stephen said was just a technicality. Now she was a guest in what used to be her sanctuary. The kitchen clock ticked too loudly. Margaret noted how every moment felt scheduled now: dinner at 5:30, sharp, medication at 6, lights out by 10. These weren't gentle reminders. They were expectations, firm and impersonal. Even the kitchen table had changed. Her old woven placemats were gone, replaced by sleek ones that looked like they belonged in a hotel lobby. Outside, the winter dusk bled slowly into night. Snowflakes clung stubbornly to the kitchen window, while inside a strange warmth hung in the air, artificial and too fragrant, like a home staging, the kind of comfort that wasn't meant to last. Stephen stepped into the kitchen just long enough to glance at her plate. "Did you eat enough, Mom?" Margaret smiled faintly. "Yes, thank you." He nodded the way someone does when they've ticked off a box. Then he turned and left, calling back over his shoulder, "Don't forget your pills." Susan had mentioned earlier casually, with that polished kind of concern that made Margaret's skin prickle, that if things didn't settle soon, they might need to consider professional care. She'd said it while drying a wine glass, as if discussing weather or groceries. You know, mom routines are good for everyone, but if you're not feeling quite yourself, there are services that really help seniors adjust. Margaret had nodded, unsure what expression her face was making. She was too tired to check. Later that evening, while the house went still, she climbed the stairs to what they now called her private space. Her old bedroom furniture was there, but rearranged, repainted, muted. She opened the drawer of the nightstand out of habit, expecting the old photograph of her and Harold in Montauk. It was gone. In its place was a generic seascape, framed in brushed silver. Tasteful. Impersonal. Her hand hovered in the empty drawer for a long time, not moving. The door creaked. Mum Stephen stood there holding a manila folder. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" She sat on the edge of the bed, her back straight. "Of course." He came in gently, like a man delivering bad news masked as opportunity. "This is nothing urgent. Just a couple of documents we didn't finish last month. Some supplemental things for the estate planning. The financial advisor recommended it. It just clarifies the rights and delegation of certain assets." He handed her a slim, stapled packet with yellow highlighted sections. "It's just about streamlining some decision-making so you don't have to worry. We'll take care of everything. Susan's already signed off on it, and once you do, it'll all be clean and handled." She held the pages. The words blurred. "What does it mean exactly?" "Nothing really changes," he said with a reassuring smile. "It just formalizes the way we're already operating. Medical choices, utilities, property upkeep. It's mostly for legal clarity." She nodded slowly, but didn't sign. When he left the room, she remained on the bed, the folder open on her lap, her eyes scanning the lines: revocable authority, full access, enduring delegation. Her lips moved silently as she reread a phrase she couldn't quite grasp. Margaret stared at the addendum, the words swimming slightly, her fingertips tracing the edge of the page. She didn't understand everything, but something didn't feel right. Since signing the transfer papers, Margaret felt like a tenant in the very life she once owned. The house moved around her now, not with her. The framed seascapes, the neutral beige throws, the metallic scented air fresheners, it all spoke of order and restraint, not belonging. She hadn't touched the addendum Stephen gave her. It lay in the drawer by the bed, resting silently beside Harold's old brown notebook, the one with ink stains and a broken binding. She hadn't dared open it yet. It had been a week. Snow blanketed the rooftop that evening, thick and soft as wool, the kind of snow that swallowed sound. Inside, the silence was not peaceful. It was practiced. Conversations had become efficient. Greetings were exchanged at doorways, not around tables. And when Margaret spoke, she often found herself answering her own questions. Becca had passed by earlier earbuds in offering a quick hug and a polite hi grandma before vanishing into her room. Margaret longed to ask her to stay, to sit, to talk, but what would she say? That the floorboards no longer creaked the way they used to, that the living room smelled like someone else's perfume. She had tried calling Elaine the other night just to hear a familiar voice, but the landline was disconnected according to Susan, and her cell phone. It now required a shared charger kept in the kitchen drawer, locked when not in use. That morning, Stephen had gently reminded her about centralizing financial accounts for ease of oversight. "We've set up a secondary account for your day-to-day," he explained. "No need for all those passwords and statements. It's just simpler this way." Simpler. Margaret had nodded like someone watching their belongings being packed while told they're going on vacation. Later that afternoon, as the wind brushed snow against the window panes, Susan stopped by her room with a glossy brochure. "Just a thought," she said, placing it on the nightstand. "These communities have full-time staff, lovely activities. People your age thrive there." Margaret didn't look up. "I'm still capable of brushing my own hair." Susan smiled thinly. "Of course. It's just a future option in case you ever feel overwhelmed." That night, Margaret stood outside Stephen's office door, holding the addendum. She knocked softly. He opened it halfway, phone to his ear. "Now's not the best time, Mum. Can we talk tomorrow?" She nodded, the paper growing damp in her palm. Back in her room, she turned on Harold's old laptop. The hinges creaked, the screen flickered alive. She typed irrevocable trust into the browser, but nothing loaded. The Wi-Fi network was gone, just blank space and a spinning wheel. She opened settings. No signal. No access. She looked around the room. Her reading lamp didn't work. The phone charger didn't charge. Only one plug near the corner still had power, the one feeding the nightlight that blinked faintly under the window. Margaret sat on the bed, the laptop cooling on her lap. She touched the old notebook, running her fingers along its cracked spine. She had not yet opened it. Somehow it felt too sacred for nights like this. The house creaked with artificial quiet. Snow still drifted outside, but inside even the hum of comfort had been muted. She glanced at the single working outlet and whispered aloud, "Is this still my home?" The wind howled through the drafty corners of the old house, and with it came the sharp knock on Margaret's bedroom door. "Me," Susan said flatly. "Maybe it's time you took a little break." The words arrived with the finality of a verdict. No tenderness, no hesitation, just a decision already made. That morning, Margaret had watched Stephen carry 2 plastic bags out of her closet. He hadn't said what was in them, and she hadn't asked. There had been a shift in his eyes, a hollowing of warmth that chilled her more than the winter air outside. Now, as the storm gathered, the house seemed to lean away from her. Cold wind leaked through the frames, and something deeper, harder settled into her bones. She no longer belonged. Susan gestured toward the foyer. "We've arranged temporary accommodations for you. A nice place. Warm. They're expecting you." "I wasn't told," Margaret replied, her voice dry. Susan folded her arms. "We weren't sure you'd take it well. But this isn't working, is it? You've been distant. It's not healthy for anyone." Margaret's fingers curled around the edge of the doorframe. "I just need time. That's all." Stephen appeared behind his wife coat zipped, holding Margaret's winter shawl. "The trust is finalized," "Mom," he said, "there's nothing to worry about. You'll be well taken care of." The phrase stung. Taken care of, like an errand or a liability. They handed her a folded paper, a printed voucher for a city shelter. "It's only for a few nights," Susan said. "Just until we figure things out." Margaret looked down. "Can I bring my things?" "Nothing valuable," Susan answered. "They have rules." Margaret walked to her room and picked up her small suitcase. One wheel was damaged and squeaked with each tilt. In her coat pocket, she slid Harold's old folder, the one with his familiar handwriting scrawled across the tabs, insurance title letters. She stepped outside into the biting wind. The snow had covered the porch steps and erased the edges of the walkway. Her breath came in short clouds, visible against the dark. The taxi Susan mentioned, a black sedan idling earlier, was now gone. She stood there alone, clutching the suitcase handle, its broken wheel dragging unevenly behind. The front door clicked shut behind her. For a moment she didn't move. The wind pulled at her scarf. Snowflakes gathered on her eyelashes. She whispered into the empty street, "Becca." Her voice vanished into the storm. Margaret reached into her coat for her phone. Only a sliver of battery remained, 7%. She scrolled slowly past names of friends long gone or numbers that would no longer answer. Then one name blinked at her, Ellie. Attorney. She hesitated, thumb hovering over the screen. And then, with the wind stinging her cheeks and the cold creeping into her joints, Margaret pressed call. Margaret sat stiffly on the metal bench inside the shelter's intake area, snow still clinging to her sleeves. She couldn't remember the last time she had chosen her own destination. Around her, the morning after the storm hummed with weary footsteps and muted voices. The fluorescent light above flickered faintly, while the smell of disinfectant and reheated plastic meals lingered like an old bruise. The call she'd placed the night before to Ellie. Attorney had only met a busy tone. No message, no answer. Just a red call failed icon on her screen. Still, she'd tried again this morning. And again. And now she waited. A nurse-like woman in a burgundy vest walked over carrying a clipboard. "You're Margaret, right?" Margaret nodded. "There's a cot for you in the back. It's not much, but it's warm." The woman smiled, soft but practiced. "There's also a social worker on site. She can help with housing paperwork. Would you be willing to fill something out?" Margaret glanced down at the form placed before her. Permanent residence status, it read. Consent for guardianship assessment. Another line noted. She didn't pick up the pen. Instead, she placed the paper gently on her lap and pulled from her coat the worn notebook that had once belonged to Harold. The cover was frayed corners, softened by time and fingers. Inside, the ink was fading, but his blocky handwriting remained. On the bunk below hers, an older woman with frizzy grey hair and a raspy voice muttered while folding her socks. "Don't let them file anything too fast," the woman said without looking up. "They tried that on me, too. Almost lost my apartment." Margaret looked at her. "Got lucky," the woman added. One lawyer stepped in. "Real sharp lady. Saved me from my daughter-in-law's dirty little signature trick." Margaret's grip tightened around the notebook. Was her name Ellie? The woman squinted. Could be. Blonde wears dark suits like she's headed to court even when she's just buying coffee. Yes, Margaret whispered. A flicker, a thread of hope. Her phone buzzed in her coat pocket. She opened it quickly. Ellie. "Sorry I missed your call. Can meet this week. You're not alone." Margaret pressed the message to her chest, then carefully tore a page from the notebook and scribbled a single line in her own hand. "I have no home, but I still have my memory." The words steadied her. From the inner pouch of her bag, she drew out a folded paper, creased, slightly yellowed. It was one of Harold's draft wills. Not notarized, but dated. Signed. In his distinct, slanted print, she traced the signature with her fingertip. Then the phone rang again, vibrating softly in her palm. Ellie's voice came through steady and familiar. "I remember you. Don't sign anything else. Meet me tomorrow morning, 10 a.m. My office." Ellie didn't look much older than the last time Margaret had seen her, but something in her eyes had changed. They were sharp now, cold as a car windshield on a winter morning. The small law office on the side street in Albany smelled of stale coffee and toner ink. Piles of case files slumped on dented metal shelves. The heater sputtered somewhere near the floor, humming against the cold outside. Margaret sat across from Ellie's cluttered desk, her gloves still on. Slowly, methodically, she opened her worn handbag and began laying out its contents. First, Harold's notebook, then the folded trust documents her son had urged her to sign. And finally, the single sheet yellowed creased that bore Harold's signature. Ellie reached for the trust paper first, adjusting her glasses. Her eyes darted across the paragraphs, lips pursed. This isn't standard. And it's suspicious. She tapped the margin. See this? The language here, in full delegation and understanding, is legal filler. But when paired with this clause about irrevocable management rights, it smells like coercion. Margaret said nothing, watching Ellie's pen move. For the first time in weeks, she felt her breath steady. She wasn't imagining things. The young secretary outside passed by, murmuring something about coffee and an open deposition. Ellie nodded absently, already flipping to the second document, the one Harold had signed years ago, the one never filed. "This is interesting," Ellie muttered. "Not notarized. But it predates the trust by a decade. And it names you as sole property custodian, not Stephen." Margaret exhaled softly. He didn't trust lawyers. He said, "If it ever came to it, this paper, and I would know." Ellie leaned back in her chair. "If your husband ever had a notarized version, or if there's any indication you were manipulated into signing the newer documents." She paused, eyes locking with Margaret's. "Then we haven't lost." Margaret nodded, slow and deliberate. "You can access property records." "Already pulled them," Ellie replied, holding up her phone. "But I need consent from you to dig further financial transfers, title movements, any power of attorney that was activated." "I consent," Margaret said immediately. Her voice was steady now. A silence settled between them, not uncomfortable, but weighted. Then Margaret hesitated. "There's something else?" Ellie looked up. "There's an old radio," Margaret said. "In the garage. Harold used to record things, his thoughts, sometimes notes for me, just in case." Her voice trailed off. "I haven't dared open it since the day he passed." Ellie's brows lifted slightly, but she didn't speak. She simply nodded, the kind of nod that meant, "We'll get there." Margaret pressed the play button on the dusty old radio she'd retrieved from a corner of the shelter's storage. It clicked once, a soft mechanical protest, then crackled. A short cough. Then Harold's voice, weathered but calm, filled the small, dim space. "If you're hearing this, my love, then I'm already gone?" Margaret sat still on the edge of the cot, wrapped in her old grey cardigan, eyes fixed on nothing. The glow from the hallway security light spilled just enough into the room to catch the shine of tears not yet fallen. The recording was slightly distorted, like memories themselves, sometimes sharp, sometimes warped. But it was Harold. Undeniably him. Not just his words, but his rhythm, his pauses, his breath. "I've been meaning to record this for a while," he continued, "just in case things don't go the way we planned." There was a pause. Papers rustled faintly in the background. "I've left everything to you, Margaret. The house, the land, the accounts. Not because I don't love Stephen, but because I don't trust what he might become without you there to guide him. Margaret's hand gripped the edge of the cot. I didn't sign over anything without your knowledge. If someone shows you papers, you never agreed to question them. Get Ellie involved. She knows what to do. The tape clicked lightly as it shifted reels. For a moment, Margaret thought it had ended. But then his voice returned lower, now more personal. I've seen how he looks at the land, like it's his birthright. But it was ours, Margaret. You and me. Every fence post, every porch beam, every brick of that fireplace, your hands were in all of it. Another pause. I hope this tape isn't necessary. I hope you never have to hear me like this, like a voice from a cold drawer. Margaret's chest rose slowly as if breathing through snow. And if for some reason you're scared or unsure, remember this. You've always been stronger than you think. Then softly he began to hum. It was off-key and slow, the lullaby he used to whistle when they walked the orchard behind the barn. Waltzing Matilda, she realized. Her eyes closed. The final sounds on the tape were him whispering, I love you still, and a gentle click as the reel spun down. Silence returned. Margaret stared at the little radio. Her hands trembled slightly, but she did not cry. Not this time. She knew now. He had seen it coming, and he had left her not just with love, but with strategy. She looked at the worn floor, then at the folder beside her. Her fingers moved with more certainty, now tucking the radio and documents together, wrapping them in her coat. She stood, and in the softest voice, more steel than sorrow, she whispered to the empty room, Stephen, you underestimated your mother. Ellie flipped open the old silver mint tin Margaret had placed on the desk. The hinges creaked slightly, and the scent of aged paper mixed with a faint trace of peppermint oil filled the air. Inside were faded receipts, curled envelopes, and folded meticulously beneath them a handwritten will dated 3 years before Harold passed. Sunlight filtered through the office blinds, striping the cluttered table in golden lines. The room was quiet, save for the soft rustle of documents, as Ellie began laying them out one by one. You said Harold kept everything important in here, she asked. Margaret nodded. He said Susan never liked sweets, especially mints. She never once opened it. Ellie let out a breath between a smirk and a hum of approval. Clever man. The will wasn't notarized, but it bore Harold's familiar scrawl, steady clear, written in deep blue fountain pen ink. It named Margaret as sole trustee and beneficiary. But more importantly, it listed 2 witnesses. One of them, George Ainsley, an old friend of Harold's, now 92, and living in a nursing home outside Utica. This gives us a path. Ellie said, her voice more animated than usual. We verify the handwriting track down the witnesses and compare this document with the trust Stephen submitted. The secretary stepped in, briefly handing Ellie a folder from the county clerk's office. Confirmation of the deed transfer and Stephen's trust registration. Looks like it was filed 6 weeks after Harold passed. No mention of a will. Ellie flipped through the papers quickly. Of course. If they didn't know this existed, they wouldn't have challenged it. But now, we have a reason to. Margaret sat straighter. Her hands were still, her eyes sharp. Ellie continued sorting. Look at this. She held up a yellowing invoice. Roof repairs 6 months before Harold passed. Signed by you? That proves ongoing financial contribution and knowledge of property maintenance. Margaret allowed herself the faintest smile. He always said, your name may not be on every paper, but your hands built this life. Ellie checked her calendar and jotted down a meeting request. I'm scheduling a visit with Mr. Ainsley. If he confirms his signature, we'll begin proceedings to challenge the trust. Margaret reached into her bag and placed Harold's fountain pen on the table. He signed everything with this. Ellie stared at the pen for a moment, then tucked it gently into an evidence sleeve. Just then, Ellie's phone buzzed. She stepped aside to answer, pacing to the window. Margaret watched her posture shift first, neutral, then alert. When Ellie returned, her face was unreadable. "That was a colleague of mine," she said quietly. "He used to represent Stephen 3 years ago." Margaret's brow creased. Represent him how Ellie hesitated. Stephen filed a property suit against his mother-in-law. Similar story. Elderly woman, estate confusion, accusations of mental incapacity. Margaret blinked. The words hit like a sudden gust through the window. She stared at the open tin, the ink-stained will, the letters from Harold. This wasn't the first time, she whispered. George closed his eyes, breathing in slowly. His hand, frail and veined, like dry riverbeds, hovered for a moment, then came to rest on the signature scrawled at the bottom of the handwritten will. "I was there," he whispered. "I saw him sign it, and I remember what he said that day. I don't trust Stephen to keep his word." Margaret sat across from him in a small chair, her coat still on. The room was warm, almost too warm, but her hands felt cold. The scent of antiseptic mingled with cinnamon from an electric air freshener plugged into the wall. Around them, George's room in the nursing home told its own quiet story. Dozens of hand-carved wooden birds lined the windowsill. A dozen old clocks ticked softly in uneven rhythm, forming a strange symphony of time long past. Ellie, seated beside Margaret, adjusted the small recorder on the table. "Mr. Ainsley, may I ask? Were you a close friend of Harold's?" George gave a lopsided smile. "We were chess partners. He beat me more times than I'll admit, but I always blamed the coffee." Margaret's lips curved faintly, remembering the Sunday mornings Harold would return, smelling of wood shavings and coffee grounds, complaining about rook traps. George continued. "It was a cold day. March, I think. We were in their kitchen. He asked me and Pastor Reynolds to be witnesses. He said his eyes grew distant. He said he needed to protect Margaret from anything unexpected." Ellie nodded. "Did he mention the trust? Or Stephen?" "Oh yes," George said, sharper now. "Said the boy had a taste for shortcuts. Susan, too. Always whispering about selling off that back lot for development, even when Harold and Margaret were still living there." George leaned forward slightly, his fingers trembling as he opened a drawer beside his bed. He pulled out a small photo worn at the corners, the colours faded. "I kept this," he said. "Don't know why. Just felt important. It's from that day, me, Harold, and Pastor Reynolds, right after we signed. See the date on the corner, printed in red, March 14th, 20XX. Margaret took the photo with reverence. In the background, just beyond Harold's shoulder, sat the familiar silhouette of a small boxy radio. Her breath caught. It was the same one she'd retrieved from the shelter. The same one that had carried Harold's final message. Ellie carefully slid the photo into a plastic sleeve. "This helps. A lot." George nodded slowly. "After the funeral, I saw Stephen with a piece of paper. He tore it. I didn't think much of it then. But now—" His voice fell to a hush. "I think he meant to destroy the will, but he missed a copy." Margaret stared at the clocks, all ticking slightly out of sync time, moving forward, but never quite evenly. Her voice was steady, quiet. He underestimated how much Harold prepared. She looked back down at the photograph. In the grainy corner, the radio waited in shadow, the same one that had preserved the truth in Harold's own voice. Margaret stood before the gate of the house that once held her every morning breath and every tired step of evening. The iron latch was newly polished cold, even through her gloves. In her coat pocket was a folded piece of paper Ellie had handed her hours earlier, a temporary revocation of power of attorney contingent on proving coercion. She hadn't come to reclaim the house. Not yet. Just to see it. To let the walls remember her face. A soft drizzle tapped the brim of her hat. Through the slightly fogged window, she saw Susan tending the indoor plants. The woman was humming, watering a jade tree that hadn't been there before. So much was new. So much had changed. Margaret did not move closer to the door. Instead, she walked the outer edge of the garden, her boots sinking slightly into the softened earth. She took her phone and began photographing the motion-activated cameras nailed crudely into the side awnings, the half-finished shed near the old swing, and the trimmed rose bushes that once grew wild by her bedroom window. She paused by the back gate. It had once led to the herb patch, where she used to pick thyme and rosemary. Without thinking, she pressed the handle. It opened. The back door had not been locked. She stood still for a long while, listening to the distant hum of the city, to the buzz of a wasp nest tucked under the gutters, and to the sound of her own pulse, steady, but no longer uncertain. "Ellie," she said into the phone, her voice barely above a whisper. Ellie picked up on the first ring. "You're there, aren't you?" "Yes." "Send the photos," and Margaret put the envelope in the mailbox. "Then walk away. For now." Margaret hung up and took out the small craft envelope from her purse. Inside were the copied documents, George's witness testimony, the transcript from Harold's audio message, and the recent declaration of revoked power. She added a single slip of paper in her own handwriting. "I never truly left this house." She slid it into the black mailbox by the front gate and closed the lid gently. Then she took 3 steps back and stood still, just observing. A wind picked up. The house loomed quiet, unaware of the storm quietly circling it now. Her phone buzzed. Stephen. She stared at the screen, the name glowing unblinking. She answered, but said nothing. His voice came tight, clipped, forced through clenched teeth. "Mother. What are you doing?" Margaret didn't reply. She tilted her face to the grey sky, letting the mist touch her skin like memory. She whispered more to the wind than the phone. "You've already invited the consequences, my son. We've received a petition for temporary property injunction. Ms. Margaret Wells, please confirm your identity." Margaret blinked, setting down her teacup. The steam rose gently in the pale winter light, cutting through the blinds. She reached for the landline with steady hands, her voice clear. "Yes, this is she." The woman on the line introduced herself as a court liaison, tasked with initial verification. Her tone was procedural, but not unkind, the kind of voice that had repeated the same phrases a dozen times already that morning. "We've reviewed your initial filing. The request to freeze the deed on the property at 314 Rosemary Lane is now under temporary review. No sale transfer or restructuring may be conducted for 30 days pending further evidence." Margaret let the words settle. 30 days. It was not much, but it was something. A wedge in the locked door. She thanked the woman and promised to send the supplemental materials. After the call ended, she took out the USB Ellie had helped her prepare, the one containing the cleaned-up version of Harold's final recording. She placed it in the envelope with the transcript, labelled it, and slid it into her case. She had learned to label everything now. Names, dates, intentions. The phone rang again. This time it was Ellie. "Heard the court's already made contact." "They have." "Good. I've queued up the first packet of evidentiary materials, but I think it's time for more than paper." Margaret hesitated. "What do you mean?" Ellie's voice sharpened. "A meeting? With Stephen? Not to settle? To expose?" There was a long pause. "I'm ready," Margaret said. Later that morning, she sat with her tea again, watching the tendrils of heat curl and vanish in the air. She didn't feel triumphant, only steady. That would be enough. An email pinged on the old tablet Ellie had loaned her from the law offices of Brent and Fairchild. Subject: Urgent, regarding Ms. Margaret Wells. It was written in careful lawyer speak, but the message beneath was bare. Our client, Mr. Stephen Wells, expresses concern that Ms. Margaret Wells is being manipulated into a course of legal action that may be emotionally and financially harmful. We urge all parties to cease escalation and consider mediation. Otherwise, repercussions will be significant. She read it twice. Then again. Not out of shock, but out of a quiet, growing recognition. They weren't ignoring her anymore. She forwarded the message to Ellie. Within seconds, Ellie replied, "They're scared now, Mrs. Wells." "Why would you do this to me?" Margaret asked, her voice void of anger or blame, just a thin veil of frost stretched across every word. The meeting room was quiet, unnaturally so. A dull yellow light buzzed above the polished table, casting soft shadows on the legal folders spread neatly before them. There were no pictures on the wall, no warm touches, just law and silence. Stephen cleared his throat. "Mum, this wasn't meant to be like this. I was trying to make sure the estate was managed properly." Margaret stirred her tea, slowly black, no sugar. The scent rose bitter and warm. She didn't look away from him. "I lived in that house for 45 years, she said softly. "How long were you there?" Stephen shifted in his chair, avoiding her eyes. "That's not the point. Things change. You need help now. You've had memory lapses." Ellie, seated at the far end of the table, tapped a button on the small device beside her. The faint red glow blinked on. She said nothing. Margaret set her teacup down with care. "I remember enough to know you asked me to sign papers I wasn't allowed to read fully. I remember your father telling me to trust Ellie if anything went wrong. And I remember the mint tin, the one Susan never looked in." Stephen's brows furrowed. "What tin?" "It doesn't matter now," she replied, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Ellie has the copies, the invoices, the recording. And George remembers everything, including the day you tried to convince your in-laws to sell their home behind their backs." His jaw tightened. "That was years ago. Circumstances were different. I was trying to... You were trying to get ahead. Always ahead." He stood pacing slightly. "It's not fair to pretend this is all black and white. Dad wasn't the only one contributing to the house. Susan and I, Margaret, held up a hand. You lived there 8 months." He stopped. She continued quieter. "And in 8 months, you managed to erase every trace of us. You replaced photos with bland art. You put my keepsakes in bins. You disconnected the Wi-Fi so I couldn't search for help." Stephen's face darkened. "You weren't supposed to find the attorney again, and yet I did." There was silence again, the kind that tightens around a room. Then Stephen muttered too quickly, "I didn't think you'd live long enough to need the house again." Click. The recording device blinked. Ellie didn't react, but her pen paused mid-note. Margaret didn't flinch. She simply looked at her son, her expression unchanged. "You said that," she said gently, out loud. Stephen seemed to realize too late the gravity of what he had just confessed. Ellie finally looked up. "That'll be all for now." Stephen turned to her. "You can't use that. That was taken out of context." "No," Ellie replied coolly. "It was recorded in a scheduled legal meeting. You're aware of the consent clause you signed when you entered this room?" He opened his mouth, but closed it again. Margaret stood up. She smoothed the fabric of her coat, adjusted her scarf. She turned to her son one last time, voice calm. "Thank you for confirming." Margaret sat alone in the conference room, The old ink stains still marked the wooden table, the kind her husband's fountain pen had once left behind. The light above buzzed faintly, casting a pale glow on the polished surface. Everyone had left. Ellie, Stephen, even the tension had walked out with them. What remained was silence and the trace of a life that felt increasingly like memory. She leaned forward slightly, running her fingers along the faint, bluish blot. It had been years, yet the shape hadn't faded. She could almost hear the scratch of the nib as he signed documents late into the night papers, spread across this very table, or one like it. Serious, but never unkind. In her mind, he appeared just briefly, laughing softly, eyebrows lifted, holding the pen out to her across the kitchen table. "Only use it to sign what you believe in," he'd said. At the time, she had laughed, brushing it off. A flourish, she thought. A romantic gesture. But now, it echoed like a bell struck underwater, slow, distant, but unmistakable. She opened her bag and took out the pen, its body worn smooth from years of handling. The cap clicked as she opened it. The nib had dried. Of course it had. But she wiped it clean anyway with a small corner of tissue folded just for this. "I'm trying," she whispered. "To keep that line steady. To keep what's right." The pen didn't answer, but something steadied in her. Her eyes drifted to the glass pane behind her. The afternoon light was shifting long winter shadows beginning to stretch across the floor. The world outside moved forward. But here in this small room, she felt time halt, like breath held too long. She reached into her coat and retrieved the fountain pen's worn case. After a moment's pause, she slipped the pen inside, closed the clasp, and tucked it back into her bag. It no longer needed to be seen, just known. Her phone buzzed. One message. She opened it and typed back, "We begin at 8, don't we?" She set the phone down, her gaze returning to the table, to the ink, to the shadow of hands that once worked beside hers, not to control, not to deceive, but to build. She inhaled deeply, exhaled. No more lurching between fear and memory. No more wondering if she had imagined the betrayal. No more pretending that dignity could be borrowed through silence. Tomorrow would not be a reckoning. It would be the quiet unveiling of truth, a truth that had been signed in ink, stored in drawers, spoken through radios, and carried in her bones. She gathered her scarf, slid it over her shoulders, and stood. The ink stain remained, faint, but still there. Before me are 2 wills, 2 signatures, and an 85-year-old mother left out in the snow. The judge's voice was calm, but the words echoed like a bell in the quiet courtroom. The small hearing chamber in Albany's district courthouse was bright with natural light, the large windows letting in pale winter sun, yet the air inside felt thin, brittle, like something might crack with the next breath. Margaret sat with her back straight, wearing a modest charcoal coat and a pair of simple leather gloves resting in her lap. In her small handbag was the fountain pen, the same one her husband once used, now symbolic more than practical. She hadn't taken it out. Not yet. But she knew it was there. Next to her, Ellie stood, papers in hand, expression composed. Her voice when she spoke was steady, deliberate. "Your Honour," Ellie began. "What we present today is not only a case of improper asset transfer. It is about coercion, about a legal sleight of hand executed against a woman in mourning. We have a voice recording from the deceased, expressing clear intent for sole ownership to remain with Mrs. Wells. We have a handwritten will witnessed by a third party. We have invoices showing home maintenance paid for by Mrs. Wells, even after her husband's passing." The judge nodded, flipping through the documents. Stephen cleared his throat from the opposite table. "If I may, Your Honour, my mother is not well." Her memory has been inconsistent. We were only trying to manage her affairs responsibly. Your Honour? Ellie interjected, we also have an audio recording from a recent mediation session where Mr. Wells stated, quote, I didn't think she'd live long enough to need the house back. The courtroom fell silent. Susan glanced sideways at Stephen, lips pressed into a line. Margaret did not flinch. When the judge turned to her, she met his eyes directly. Mrs. Wells, he said, do you remember the details of these documents? She took a slow breath. I don't need memory, Your Honour, she said, voice clear. I have the truth. It was never about forgetting. It was about being erased. And I'm not ready to disappear yet. Stephen shifted in his seat. Susan looked down at her nails. The judge nodded once. He made a few notes, then folded his hands before him. Based on the evidence presented, he began this court finds sufficient grounds to issue a temporary injunction. All transfers of property are to be frozen. Effective immediately, Mrs. Margaret Wells is granted temporary right of residence at the disputed property, pending final determination. Margaret didn't smile. She didn't cry. She simply bowed her head once gently, as though honouring something far older than the court itself. Ellie squeezed her hand. Outside the courtroom, as the hallway slowly filled with voices and the shuffle of coats, Susan brushed past her. Her words were low, almost hissed. Think you've won. This isn't over. Margaret didn't answer. She only looked at Susan for half a second, calm, still unblinking. She didn't need to win all at once. She only needed to be heard. The key turned with a soft click, the same sound it had always made ever since the lock was first installed 30 years ago. Margaret remembered holding Stephen with one arm, balancing a bag of groceries in the other, fumbling with this very key in winter wind. Now her hands were steadier than expected, or perhaps just colder. The house was quiet. No footsteps, no voices. Stephen was away, as Ellie had confirmed. Susan, she assumed, was watching somewhere through the hidden cameras she and Stephen had installed. Margaret didn't care. She walked in slowly without switching on the lights. The dusk pooled around her, not threatening, but familiar. She slipped off her coat and draped it on the old hook by the stairs, the one her husband had fixed countless times. The hallway smelled of lemon cleaner and something synthetic. But beneath it, faint and lingering, was the scent of old wood. She walked past the framed art Susan had put up, generic, cold, muted colours. The wall used to hold photographs. Her photographs. Birthdays. Sunday dinners. A crayon drawing Becca once made of their backyard tree. In the living room, the large frame on the mantel was empty. The photograph had been removed, but the outline remained sun-faded into the wallpaper. Margaret touched the frame gently, as if it might remember. She made her way to the kitchen. Nothing was out of place, and yet nothing belonged. The kettle was a new model. The mugs were uniform ceramic, unchipped, unloved. Still in the back of the cupboard, behind the tall glasses, she found it the chipped white teacup with the blue rim. A fracture ran down the side, fine like a wrinkle. She ran her thumb along it, then filled the kettle with water. While it boiled, she opened a drawer near the pantry. Tucked under a stack of coupons and expired receipts, she found a yellowing slip of paper, her husband's handwriting unmistakable. Don't sign anything if you're tired. If it doesn't feel right, it isn't. Love, R. Her throat tightened. She folded the note carefully and slipped it into her cardigan pocket. The kettle whistled. She poured the water, placed the tea bag, and sat by the window. From here she could see the garden. The rhubarb patch had been paved over. The swing Becca once played on was gone. But the tree remained tall, defiant, slightly tilted from a storm years ago. She sipped her tea. It tasted faintly of memory. As the last rays of light faded, she walked into the den. She didn't switch on the lamp. She just sat down on the old armchair, the one Susan had said would be replaced. Margaret had insisted it stay. She ran her fingers over the fabric, then leaned back, exhaling slowly. "You got the house, Stephen," she whispered to the air, "but you lost something more important." Her voice was soft, not bitter, not angry, just true. The doorbell rang. She didn't rise. Not yet. She took another sip, her hand steady, her eyes on the darkening garden. The morning light filtered into the reading room like a hush, thin, steady, and almost warm. Margaret sat by the wide window, the scent of old paper and cedar bookshelves grounding her in the space she once called hers. She had found the envelope in the pile of redirected mail that had just arrived, thick paper yellowed, slightly around the edges, addressed by hand, Mrs. Margaret Wells, C.O. Legal Custody, Albany County. There was no return address, but the handwriting struck her as oddly familiar. She opened it carefully, the way one might peel back years not paper. "Dear Mrs. Wells, I don't know if you remember me. My name is James Beckett. I used to deliver your mail every morning for almost 12 years until I retired 3 years ago. Your husband always waved even on snowy days. I write this now because I've been following the news and I feel I must speak even if it's late." Margaret paused, her thumb brushing over the page as if to still the slight tremble in her hand. She remembered James. Always wore a wool cap even in spring. Always brought the mail to the door, even when the mailbox was just 5 steps away. She read on. "One morning, near the end of his life, I saw something strange. Your son's wife. I think her name was Susan, brought out a stack of papers. Your husband was on the porch in a recliner. He looked dazed, like he'd been given too much medication. She held his hand and said, 'Just this one, okay. It's just to help with utilities.' He nodded slowly and signed, but he wasn't reading. Not really there. She noticed me watching. She turned and said, 'Just some paperwork he's agreed to sell.' She smiled, but I didn't smile back. Beneath the letter was a second page, a photocopy of an old notepad with blocky writing in blue pen. 'Wells House, Susan, present 10:17 a.m. He seemed confused. 12th March. The handwriting was James's. The paper had a faded corner, and the copy's timestamp marked a scan date 3 years ago. Ellie arrived later that morning. Margaret handed her the letter in silence. The younger woman read through it, her eyes narrowing with every line. She pulled out her laptop and brought up the affidavit Susan had submitted to the court, the one stating Richard Wells had read. Signed and fully consented to the house transfer on March 12th, 3 years ago, at 10:30 a.m. It's the same day, Ellie said. Same hour. Margaret nodded slowly, eyes on the note. He didn't sell the house, she whispered. Not of his own will. Ellie didn't speak for a long moment. Then, almost reverently, she said, "And now we can prove it." Margaret placed the letter and the notepad copy gently on the table. She folded her hands, breathing deeply. The house was still. The past had just spoken not through courtroom speeches or affidavits, but through a simple act of memory. A retired mailman. A moment unforgotten. Outside, the wind moved through the leafless trees. For the first time in weeks, it didn't sound cold. "Would you like to make a statement?" Margaret turned to the young reporter by the gate, her breath clouding in the afternoon air. She smiled softly. "No, dear. I just want to have tea in my room with the window open." The girl blinked, unsure how to respond, and Margaret walked past her without another word. Inside the house, silence greeted her like an old friend, the echo of boots on wooden floors, the scent of dried lavender tucked behind the radiator, the familiar click of the hallway light. Everything felt untouched, yet finally returned. Ellie had left earlier that morning after the final ruling. She'd handed Margaret the court's official decision in a sealed envelope and a single brass key. Your name, Ellie had said, is now the only one that matters on any deed. Margaret had nodded, said thank you, and hugged her just once, gently. They both knew it wasn't a celebration. Now, with the front door shut behind her, Margaret moved through the rooms like she was brushing dust off old memories. She stopped by the small table near the kitchen, where a photo frame lay face down. Lifting it carefully, she slipped a restored family photograph back inside. Richard's eyes looked out from the image, steady warm. Stephen was just a boy then. She didn't allow her gaze to linger there too long. Outside, the apple tree was still bare, its branches, like outstretched hands, frozen in time. Richard had planted it decades ago. It had never yielded much fruit, but it stood through every winter. Margaret stepped onto the porch and ran her fingers along the bark. Back inside, she filled the kettle and chose her favorite chipped teacup, the one with the small crack near the handle, the one Susan had once deemed too old to bother with. She placed it on the tray with quiet reverence. The key Ellie had given her sat beside the cup. Margaret didn't pick it up. She didn't need to. Just knowing it was hers without question was enough. As she sipped her tea, she picked up the telephone and dialed slowly. Mr. Beckett. This is Margaret Wells. I just wanted to say thank you. And, if you ever want a quiet place to read your newspaper, my garden has a bench now. He chuckled through the line voice, scratchy but clear. I might take you up on that, Mrs. Wells. She smiled. Please do. As the sun dipped behind the ridge, casting long shadows through the windows, Margaret walked to the front door and slid the bolt shut with a clean, certain click. She didn't lock it out of fear. She locked it out of peace. No more proving. No more pleading. Just stillness. The light inside the house stayed on long after dusk fell, and somewhere deep within the walls, it felt like the house was finally breathing again. Would you like to make a statement? Margaret turned to the young reporter by the gate, her breath clouding in the afternoon air. She smiled softly. No, dear. I just want to have tea in my room with the window open. The girl blinked, unsure how to respond, and Margaret walked past her without another word. Inside the house, silence greeted her like an old friend. The echo of boots on wooden floors, the scent of dried lavender tucked behind the radiator, the familiar click of the hallway light, everything felt untouched, yet finally returned. Ellie had left earlier that morning after the final ruling. She'd handed Margaret the court's official decision in a sealed envelope and a single brass key. Your name, Ellie had said, is now the only one that matters on any deed. Margaret had nodded, said thank you, and hugged her just once, gently. They both knew it wasn't a celebration. Now, with the front door shut behind her, Margaret moved through the rooms like she was brushing dust off old memories. She stopped by the small table near the kitchen, where a photo frame lay face down. Lifting it carefully, she slipped a restored family photograph back inside. Richard's eyes looked out from the image, steady warm. Stephen was just a boy then. She didn't allow her gaze to linger there too long. Outside, the apple tree was still bare, its branches like outstretched hands, frozen in time. Richard had planted it decades ago. It had never yielded much fruit, but it stood through every winter. Margaret stepped onto the porch and ran her fingers along the bark. Back inside, she filled the kettle and chose her favorite chipped teacup, the one with the small crack near the handle, the one Susan had once deemed too old to bother with. She placed it on the tray with quiet reverence. The key Ellie had given her sat beside the cup. Margaret didn't pick it up. She didn't need to. Just knowing it was hers without question was enough. As she sipped her tea, she picked up the telephone and dialed slowly. Mr. Beckett. This is Margaret Wells. I just wanted to say thank you. And if you ever want a quiet place to read your newspaper, my garden has a bench now. He chuckled through the line voice, scratchy but clear. I might take you up on that, Mrs. Wells. She smiled. Please do. As the sun dipped behind the ridge, casting long shadows through the windows, Margaret walked to the front door and slid the bolt shut with a clean, certain click. She didn't lock it out of fear. She locked it out of peace. No more proving. No more pleading. Just stillness. The light inside the house stayed on long after dusk fell, and somewhere deep within the walls, it felt like the house was finally breathing again. She didn't win a fortune, nor did she demand applause. She simply reclaimed a name, a door key, and a quiet morning where no one could evict her memories. Justice may arrive late, but it resonates like the final chord of a long-forgotten melody, steady, undeniable. Sometimes it only takes one woman's stillness to expose the tremble in everyone else's noise. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and comment your thoughts below. Type 1 if you resonate with this story.